If they were to recommend quarantines or vaccinations or drugs or lockdowns or whatever, those recommendations would now be seen as legally binding orders. And that is fundamentally different than the situation that we are in right now. And if you actually really think about it, that wipes out sovereignty, that wipes out fundamental freedoms and human rights, and quite frankly, your dignity when officials, bureaucrats, in Geneva or elsewhere, their regional directors, would be empowered to tell everybody what they had to do. And that's just not acceptable. That cannot be. We cannot allow that to happen.
If you've lived through the psychological operation that was rolled out on a global scale over the last 3 years, then you're probably aware of the WHO, or the World Health Organization, and its health directives, such as the non-evidence-based promotion of things like lockdowns, social distancing, community masking, and injecting yourself with a novel pharmaceutical product. Mary Ugolini here with Rebel News, reminding you that the failed WHO policies like lockdowns were responsible for the decimation of small businesses and sharp increase in suicides and mental health crisis, all while undergoing the largest wealth transfer of our time. And yet the harm caused by these devastating knee-jerk responses are never discussed by the WHO or its member states. Instead, they want to strengthen the WHO's mandate and ensure compliance in its totality for future health emergencies. This is being done through two mechanisms. The first is a proposed pandemic treaty.
The global accord now being negotiated will underpin the global approach to epidemics and pandemics for decades and maybe even centuries to come. And that's why we call it generational agreement.
The second is through amendments to existing international law referred to as International Health Regulations, or IHR. And joining me now to discuss what he refers to as a global coup by the WHO in making these amendments and adjustments is researcher James Roguski. We discuss the implications that the IHR amendments may have, but first I asked James what the difference is between the proposed pandemic treaty and the amendments to international health regulations. Check it out.
Well, there are many differences, many similarities, and the most important thing to remember is that they simply are two separate things. And most people cross-pollinate the information and get it all mixed up in their mind. And so at the moment, I am much more concerned about the proposed amendments to the international health regulations because they are much easier to implement into legally binding international law. The talk about a pandemic treaty is a much more difficult process. It will take longer. I'm not concerned that it's going to happen, tomorrow or something like that. But the proposed amendments to the international health regulations have been kept very quiet, and they appear to be rushing to submit them by a self-imposed deadline of January 15th, which is a little bit more than 4 months in advance of the 76th World Health Assembly in May, because there is a 4-month requirement that things be submitted in order to be considered in May. And so they're not doing that with the treaty. It's on a slower track. This appears to be something that they could adopt in May. And the Indonesian health minister, who's really a banker, said exactly that during the G20 earlier, actually at the end of 2022.
Philosophically, in the Chinese culture, they believe every crisis, it open a danger aspect, but also give you an opportunity aspect. So in this crisis, in the health sector, we all see that this is the biggest opportunity for us to do a major global health architecture reform. And we are doing it.
You sounded the alarm here that there are a bunch of secret backdoor meetings taking place this entire week. So from January 9th until the 13th, roughly, in Geneva, Switzerland, by the International Health Regulations Review Committee, and that's part of the umbrella of the WHO. When is all of this expected to be shared with the general public?
Well, whenever they darn well please would be the only answer I could give. What they have done with their previous meetings is they have said that they are sworn to confidentiality. And so they answered, the International Health Regulations Review Committee answers only to the Director General. And so they will be submitting their report of their work, which I will take a guess, it's an educated guess. They have received proposed amendments from 15 or 16 nations. Japan's proposal seems to have disappeared. And that is approximately 200 pages, which they've distilled down to a 46-page document, which they made available just before Christmas. And so it would seem that they are fine-tuning that document. It has some technical errors and some typographical errors and some redundancies. And one would, reasonably think that they are cleaning up that proposed set of amendments to hand over to the Director General, who would then give it to all of the nations 4 months in advance of May's assembly so that it could then be considered. What they did in 2022 is they never got around to making it public until I made a stink about it in April, and it didn't show up publicly until April 12th last year. I suspect they might try to do the same thing, but now we're a little bit more ahead of the game and we're aware of it. Certainly, if all of the nations of the world are proposing amendments to international law, one would think that that should be made public. I've done freedom of information requests because I know each nation will be receiving it. And so after the 15th, we'll be doing that and hopefully around the world. But they will share it with us when they darn well feel like sharing it with us. And that's just not good enough.
Just in scrutinizing this International Health Regulations Review Committee a little bit, how many of these people are elected versus appointed bureaucrats? Do you even know?
They're all appointed. They're all experts. The one person from the United States who does not represent the United States, they are all acting as experts chosen from the pile of experts that the WHO normally chooses from. Lawrence Oglethorpe Gostin has a 54-page resume. Okay, all of these people are fine, upstanding citizens. They've been chosen as technocrats to craft this piece of international law. And there's an aspect of it that I want to touch on in that what happened back in May, and you mentioned Canada specifically, they basically said in May, look, you're trying to rush these things through. We want more time. And so what was agreed upon in May of 2022 was that there would be a process that in the middle of November, a working group made up of member nations to address proposed amendments to the IHR would meet in mid-November and start these discussions. All of the proposals were in by September 30th. And what happened on October 1st is Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General, created, as is his right under the rules of the WHO, he created an expert review committee, not to review what the working group did, but to interject and hijack those discussions and essentially take them over. And so these 18 hand-selected technocrats who are unaccountable to anybody and are sworn to confidentiality have taken the nation's proposals, bypassed the working group, and are going to be submitting it directly to the World Health Organization. There has been no public comment, and quite frankly, there's been no public awareness.
Mm-hmm. Until now, hopefully. And what I gather from many of your shares on your Substack and otherwise is that basically this is a collusion between global health oligarchs and Big Pharma to expand their reach and really to prioritize profits. Where was it that you discovered that this may be more about expanding those profits and creating customers rather than about creating health and cures?
I borrowed one of their acronyms. One of the powers or authorities that the WHO has is to declare, just because they feel like it, a public health emergency of international concern. And I woke up one day, and quite frankly, it was just an inspiration. Oh, PHEIC, that's fake. but that also could stand for the Pharmaceutical Hospital Emergency Industrial Complex. And so in the annexes, okay, there are 66 articles in the International Health Regulations, but there are 9, and they have proposed a 10th annex. In Annex 1, it lists all of what they call core capacities. And essentially what that is that they feel nations should have certain capabilities, certain warehoused products, whatever it is you would do to maintain preparedness, for any kind of an emergency, right? Sort of prepping on a national basis for some kind of health emergency. And so the language that has gotten changed in there, along with what is changed in Article 13A, would make the Director General be able to have an allocation plan where if there was an issue that they just declared, they would then be able to say to country A, you have to get your manufacturers to make what we tell you and give it to country B. And the whole point behind all of this comes, I think, from a really misguided notion that the products that were used to treat people, whether they were drugs or injectables, are still believed by many of the people in these negotiations to be of benefit rather than harm. And so they feel that they were shortchanged because the wealthy nations bought 10 times what they needed, and the relatively poor nations feel that they didn't get as much as they wanted. And so they're arguing for equity, and they want all of that manufacturing and all of that structural, investment to show up in their home countries. And so what actually happened in May, and now this is an analysis, this is my opinion, is that the countries that pushed back didn't push back for the same reasons that you or I may have pushed back. They said, wait a minute, this is all just requirements upon us. These are just sticks beating on us. Where are the carrots? Where are the incentives? Where is the money? Okay, and so they use the word equity. They think of it in terms of, well, we didn't get enough of those poisons and we want more of them. But equity really means money. And at some point you realize that they're not talking about anything health related at all. And I don't even refer to them anymore as the International Health Regulations. They're actually the International Surveillance Regulations. And what the Indonesian health minister revealed was that he said very clearly that Indonesia had submitted proposed amendments to institute a global health certificate. And that is of great concern because that, whether it's a digital ID or a vaccine passport or a health certificate or a prophylaxis certificate or a testing certificate, whether you have it on your phone or on a piece of paper or on an ID card, this is all about tracking, tracing, compliance, and governance. It's got really nothing at all to do about health.
So let's have a digital health certificate acknowledged by WHO. If you have been vaccinated or tested properly, then you can move around. So for the next pandemic, instead of stopping the movement of the people 100%, which clogged the economy globally, you can still provide some movement of the people. Indonesia has achieved, G20 country has agreed to have this digital certificate using WHO standard, and we will submit into the next World Health Assembly in Geneva as the revision to international health regulation. So hopefully for the next pandemic, we can still see some movement of the people, some movement of the goods, and movement of the economy.
And we saw throughout the pandemic that these IDs and these digital health certificates were very much normalized. And so people are more apt to comply now because, well, it's literally, and the hashtag coined, the new normal. In addition to the surveillance state and one world surveillance government, really, that this may usher in, what else is there in these amendments and proposed regulation changes that should alarm not only the nation states, but more so its population. And repeatedly, you mention in your Substack and in your videos, we the people. So why should people be concerned with all of this?
We're not going to be able to condense it into our brief time here. I did a video, audio, and a transcript, 100 reasons why we should oppose this. And the soundbite one is the proposed amendments to Article 3 that was submitted by the delegation from the nation of India. And when I first read the international health regulations in 2022, the first principle in Article 3, which is core principles, why do we even have these international health regulations? It reads now currently that they must be implemented with the full respect for the dignity and human rights and fundamental freedoms of people. And so that sounded okay. That was like, I agree with that. Well, the Indian delegation has submitted amendments that literally would cross out respect for dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. And if you don't read the entire 46-page document and you only stop there, it'll give you an idea of how they will then be behaving. What these amendments are fundamentally doing is attempting to change the WHO's fundamental status under Article 23 in the WHO Constitution to give recommendations, to be an advisory organization, which is all they have really done throughout this. People have just assumed that their recommendations were obligations. Well, they said back in July that they had decided very clearly that under Articles 19, 20, 21, and 22, they want to make the situation legally binding. And so in Article 1, you can see that the amendments would cross out the words non-binding. And essentially, if they were to recommend quarantines or vaccinations or drugs or lockdowns or whatever, those recommendations would now be seen as legally binding orders. And that is fundamentally different than the situation that we are in right now. And if you actually really think about it, that wipes out sovereignty, that wipes out fundamental freedoms and human rights, and quite frankly, your dignity when officials, bureaucrats, in Geneva or elsewhere, their regional directors would be empowered to tell everybody what they had to do. And that's just not acceptable. That cannot be. We cannot allow that to happen.
Well, and how do we exit from these treaties and exit the World Health Organization and ensure that this doesn't happen while disavowing this concept of global health that basically threatens and undermines the health sovereignty of independent nations?
To use an analogy, the similar question would be, if you knew someone who was in an abusive relationship and their spouse wanted them to sign a document handing over all legal authority over them, I think you would say very clearly, you're not going to be able to rehabilitate this person. You're not going to be able to negotiate and change them. They're incorrigible. That they want complete and total control. You need to leave this relationship. Now, I'm in the United States. You're in Canada. In the United States, when we joined the WHO and Harry Truman signed a joint resolutions approved by Congress, it said in there very clearly, we're here to join. We'll be happy to participate to help in the health of the world. But, if we want to leave, we're out of here. We'll give you a 1-year notice. We'll pay whatever we may owe you, but we're gone. Okay. And quite frankly, nations leave treaty agreements all the time. What it requires is the political will, and the political will is not going to come from the politicians down. It's going to come from the will of the people being impressed upon all of the politicians, whether it's parliament or Congress or premiers or prime ministers or presidents or whomever it may be. Job number one is to realize that the WHO is trying to keep this really quiet. They don't want anybody to pay attention to this. They want to just sneak it through because it does not require any 2/3 advice and consent by the Senate. It does not even require a signature. These are amendments to an agreement that is already been agreed to by all of the member nations. And the process by which amendments happen is if a simple majority were to adopt this in May, it would be law. There would be no other process needed. Okay. And so that's why I'm much more concerned about this. It's not a treaty. We are not talking about the proposed pandemic treaty. These are amendments to an existing agreement that could be slammed through before anybody noticed. And, thank you for helping me make, your audience aware of it. Spread the word, take this video, share it far and wide. The more people who have their eyes on this, the better. And, form your own opinion of the information. I've tried to analyze it and present it so people can comprehend what the heck is really going on here. But 99.999% of everybody on the planet is oblivious to the fact that they're trying to do this. So, number one, we spread the word. People have to stand up and say no. We don't want to just allow you to take away our dignity, our fundamental freedoms, and our human rights. No. And if the negotiations go forward, quite frankly, the way out is to leave the WHO, because this is an abusive relationship and we need to leave it.
The claim by some that this accord is an infringement of national sovereignty is quite simply wrong. It will not give WHO any powers to do anything without the express permission of sovereign nation states. If nations can negotiate treaties against threats of our own making, like nuclear, chemical and biological weapons, tobacco and climate change, then surely it makes sense for countries to agree on a common approach to a common threat that we did not fully create and cannot fully control, a threat that comes from our relationship with nature itself.
At this point, leaving the WHO seems like a logical and reasonable step for any nation that does not want to follow the WHO's proven track record of causing grotesque harm while promoting very little actual health. If you would like to find out more, you can follow James at his Substack that I will link below in the written component of this report, where he openly shares his phone number and posts countless articles from the WHO directly so that you can stay informed and on top of their attempt at imposing an unelected stranglehold on health sovereignty of various nations. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. If you agree that the WHO should not have its mandate strengthened, then you can head over to our special website at exposethewho.com and sign our petition there. At that special website, you can also stay up to date on all of the reports as they come out on this subject. That website again is exposethewho.com.